Hi, everyone, and welcome to our season finale of our Hot Take Summer Series. We've been engaging with thought leaders from across the B2B tech industry to discuss buyer trends and different go-to-market strategies to meet those buyers' expectations. At Trust Radius, we've studied the evolution of B2B tech buying and the huge shifts that have happened over the last 8 years. We publish these trends every year in our B2B Disconnect report. And so this last report that we released earlier this summer, a lot of the data has been showing us that companies are really underestimating the value of brand awareness, perception, and trust. And this is especially true when it comes to the enterprise. And so vendors have been really scaling back on their brand investment at the same rate that buyers have been gravitating towards familiar products that they've heard of, been exposed to, or heard about from their peers. And so when we think about the enterprise buyer, we kind of segmented out a lot of that data in our latest report. And so 86% of enterprise buyers said that they created a shortlist based on products that they knew before even starting the research, before ever even contacting a salesperson or that company. The buying groups have kind of stabilized around 5 people and mostly consisting of senior level titles. Also, 87% of them stated that the sales cycle took at least 12 months. 68% of enterprise buyers said that they were still very skeptical about the market. They're really still skeptical about AI and using AI to help them make a technology decision. They also, at the same rate, said they would rather talk to their peers. Lastly, the use of analyst reports have gone down tremendously year over year, and it's hit an all-time low this year, with only 14% of enterprise buyers saying that they use analyst reports when making a technology decision. So really interesting data that we collected from our report, which brings us to our topic today. And I'm really excited to have this kind of group of experts and friends here talk through some of their playbooks, their experiences when building a go-to-market strategy to reach enterprise buyers. So I'd like to welcome Allison Metcalf, who is the CRO at Cloudinary, John Miller, who is the founder of Marketo and Engagio, and Scott Farrer, who has been the VP of pre-sales at many companies across the tech industry. So thank you all so much for being here today. Really excited to kind of jump into this topic and get some insights from you all. So with that, Allison, I'm going to kind of kick it over to you first. And I want to hear more about, your experience of reaching and engaging enterprise buyers, and you've kind of done that across your career. How has that evolved over the years?
So I think, and it's timely and interesting that John is here too, because I think about the advent of marketing automation back in the day, and how that was such a game changer. And now we've had these sales engagement platforms that have also, really changed the way they're reaching out to enterprise buyers. I think the biggest thing that we're all experiencing, I'm sure, is email fatigue and the nurturing, the fatigue of that nurturing, right? I don't know about you, but I'm a CRO. I don't sell B2B, and I don't sell B2B productivity software. I sell a platform we sell primarily to developers. But I personally wake up every morning, and frankly, the first thing I do is go through my inbox and delete all of the emails that I've gotten from various SDRs. And I have a lot of empathy for what they're doing, but it doesn't hit the mark, and it's not capturing my attention. I notice even in my own self as a buyer, what I really do rely on more is hearing from peers about what things that worked for them. I get jealous of that. I'm like, what? You did this and that worked really well. And that gets me really excited. Even Allison, when you and I were together at that Pavilion CRO summit, I walked away with a lot of engagement from different platforms and technologies that I had not even heard of, that I was really excited about. And then the other thing I'm just it's really fresh in my mind, because I'm looking, as I'm jumping on this, we use a third-party win-loss analysis consultant that interviews our wins and losses. And I'm just literally fresh off reading a pretty big win that we had, and the CTO, who was the economic buyer, just stressing the importance of the case studies that he was shown, or being sent podcasts, or being sent other, evidence from his peers and not from us, right? That was really what put him over put him into the win category. So I really do what you're talking about, and in terms of hearing from peers versus from salespeople is super relevant to me. And I would say the other big thing that I'm hearing or experiencing a lot is when buyers do come to us, to your point, they've done so much research already. They know what they want typically. And so the biggest thing that we have to figure out, and I'm thinking a lot about, is the demo experience. Making sure that you're not kitchen sinking your platform. You're so excited about all the cool things your stuff does. But if I'm coming to you with one problem and you try to sell me on 10 problems, that my one problem gets lost. And so as much as I'm thinking a lot about case studies and peer-to-peer conversations and getting those stories out there, I'm also thinking about really pushing my sales team to customize how they're talking to the leads they do have, to make sure that they're directly addressing the problem, and again, not kitchen sinking the whole thing. That turns buyers off a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I completely agree when it comes to, that kind of customer proof, but they have to have some kind of like introduction to you. And it's great that you're kind of going all the way up to the C-suite, but it's like the influence that you kind of have across the deal. So John, what do you, in your career, what are you thinking are like the primary differences between, the behavior of like an enterprise buyer and that customer versus, mid-market, and SMB?
Yeah, let me answer that. But actually, I wanted to just briefly build on Allison first.
Yeah.
Where you asked the question kind of how is selling to the enterprise evolved, over time. And one thing I did want to sort of mention was, in the early part of my career, selling enterprise was just all about the solution sale and the super high powered, expensive sales rep. And then, fast forward a few years and we started seeing PLG make its way even into the enterprise, right? And that was a change of things. And I think the reason I wanted to mention this is I think we're on the cusp of another change where as AI becomes more and more part of a solution, it's going to become more important to have access to enterprise data, and you can't really PLG access to enterprise data because there's so many security checks and hoops that you kind of have to go through. So I wonder if we're actually going to see a pendulum swift, kind of move a little away from PLG in the enterprise, and because of sort of the need for enterprise access to data. So, but to your specific question about how is enterprise different from kind of SMB, I'll highlight three things. The first one I think is pretty obvious, and your research report shows it, which is that buying groups are bigger. In the enterprise, there's more stakeholders, there's more people that you need to talk to, and that means that you need to sort of navigate all those different players with sort of often conflicting priorities, longer sales cycles. So you need to plan your business accordingly. I've seen companies get into trouble when they sort of are used to saying, well, I need pipeline in Q2 to close business in Q3. And then they start moving up market and they don't realize that they actually need their pipeline Q4 of last year to close the business in Q3. I think second, on the margin, enterprise buyers are probably more risk averse. Now, I don't think that's necessarily true of the business buyer as like a universal statement, but it's almost definitely true on the IT department and security policies. And I sort of mentioned this already, just expect many more, hoops to kind of go through on the kind of IT and risk side. And then last but not least, I think your report was all about this is the year of brand, and how important brand is. And your report actually showed that brand is even more important in the enterprise. The stats I think was 86% of enterprise buyers, kind of had shortlisted products even before starting the process, versus 78% overall. So they're both big, just a little bit more on the enterprise. And I think your report also said that 66% of enterprise buyers chose a product that they called an established leading product. So I've been saying for 2 years now, B2B companies need to invest more in brand, build trust and safety, as not just kind of traditional demand gen. And I think it's even more important when you sell the enterprise.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. And I think that when you're looking at the enterprise, it becomes much more complex. So kind of like your sphere of influence within the company, it has to be really broad. Have these people heard of you? Because it's not just your kind of like buyer, but you also have to talk to procurement, legal. Yeah, that's true everywhere, but it's even more complex when you kind of get into the enterprise. And so Scott, kind of putting on your sales hat, how do you think about organizing around the enterprise, especially if you're moving up market, right? Because most companies, they start maybe more mid-market SMB and then they want to move up market. But can you talk about how do you evaluate the decision to move up market, and what are like those critical factors?
Yeah, and in most of the companies that I've been with, it's always been a steady growth or a shift from the main source of revenue coming from that SMB or down market sources into enterprise. Everyone wants the enterprise, right? That's the golden carrot. And so, to John's point, the meat and potatoes of the sales cycle actually aren't dramatically different. There's a ton of overlap between those two circles. It's, whether you're using Bant or something like MedPick, there's still just a kind of the bread and butter of the sales process that has to happen. But one of the big changes is that it's just an inherently more complex selling process. And to John's point, or to kind of echo part of what he was saying, when you're used to a transactional or more transactional sale down market that can close in days or weeks, it can sometimes be pretty much a system shock to know that this could be months or even years in the making. And so that requires a different profile of rep and sales leader as well. So these are people who are really focused on stakeholder management, navigating the different buying groups, and avoiding kind of the happy ears that can happen when they start getting the right motions from what they think is a mobilizer. And so what I've seen in the past is you don't want to turn off the spigot of what got you here. And so you really need to kind of start slow. And that can be pragmatically, promoting some folks who seem to have the chops of that, larger picture deal cycle in mind, or hiring net new slowly to test it out and seeing how it goes. And then basically pour gas on that fire as it starts off. And then in my previous role at Sixth Sense, one of the functions that we spun up that was really advantageous, and I would actually highly recommend it for enterprise and above market deals, is the advent of a business value team. And the business value team offers two different types of kind of pro forma value statements. One, if we're talking to you as a prospect, and like some of this is going to depend upon the type of solution you're selling and the metrics you have available and the types of benchmarks that you have. But as a prospect, we would basically look at their current sales metrics. We're selling a sales and marketing solution around conversion rates, average deal size, times, all that kind of stuff. And we would look at a benchmark data and say, you can anticipate this much lift. And then we'd show our work and how that happened, so it was defensible. After the sale, and about 2 quarters once the product had been implemented, we would do a post-value statement. How did we do on that ROI projection? And so enterprise customers are starting to, that's starting to become a kind of a mandatory versus a nice to have. They want to see what the ROI will be before they sign the PO, and then they want to be able to track it afterwards to justify the renewals going forward. So that was a big part of our up market motion as well.
Yeah, can you go into like and John and Allison kind of talked about this a little bit, but like the pipeline and like how you guys thought about, okay, we're moving up market. How do we kind of build out those kind of customer segments? How do we essentially goal on the pipeline that we need, and thinking about like the acceleration of that pipeline and so forth?
Yeah, I mean, and some of it starts to happen organically because you have a team that traditionally is selling to, or your kind of ICP is in that lower end market, but every now and then a big fish swims by and you happen to get it, right? And so some of this kind of just happens by chance, and that can be the start of a new segment, and you can kind of a new vertical if that works out. But we would essentially look at carving up kind of typical territory management, looking at the available total addressable market, and then looking at the targets. And again, those targets, I think early days going into enterprise need to be realistic so that you don't end up, doing damage and stubbing your own toe with over expectations. And then it's really about finding the people to staff those, and then looking at, if you're an old school MQL shop, which I know might be like verboten on this type of call, then you want to kind of run that math for that funnel. And if you're using account-based approaches, you want to use that same type of ratios to determine how you're going to attack that pipe.
And so Allison, we worked together early days live ramp, and I remember when we made like that shift to, move up market, and we actually went after like a completely different vertical. What were the indicators like during that time that we were like, great, we need to go after a completely different vertical? Was it like our product? It was like, there's so many factors in there. And you were kind of, you were building out more of the post-sale team at the time. So I'd love to hear kind of like your thoughts on, okay, we saw kind of this problem in the market. We had maybe product market fit, but you kind of saw it from the post-sale point of view.
Yeah, but I also think, going up market was almost a necessity to be able to achieve our growth ambitions. It's kind of interesting, back in 2013, 2014, the early live ramp days, we were doing partner-led growth or ecosystem-led growth before that had a term. It's kind of funny now, people are coining that. I'm like, oh, that's what we did, right? But one of the problems we had with that partner-led growth or ecosystem-led growth is we were not connected to the end buyer as much as we wanted to be. And so if we wanted to expand, if we wanted to really realize more upsell, cross-sell, especially in the post-sale side, we needed the direct access to those end customers. So while it was really successful for us for a long time to be very partner first, in order for us to expand and have a more stable business and to achieve that growth, we needed to build out a muscle to have that direct connection. And if you recall, it was difficult.
Yes.
When we were doing partner-led growth, our conversations were extremely technical. It was, we were explaining the nuts and bolts of how this thing worked and the problem that it solved, and the resellers and partners that we were working with were painting pictures to the end customer, which is the brand. And we fumbled and struggled for a long time to figure out the right way to be able to talk directly to those brands. And a big lesson we had to learn was that kind of technical explanation, that whiteboard sale that we were really successful with in the partner-led growth days, was not going to work in the, talking directly to the end customer. So we had to make a lot of big changes as we learned to pivot. And to your point, Scott, we had to change the profile of who we were hiring on the sales team, right? Because the early days we were focused on hiring. I mean, remember our mentor, Allison, James, I was like, this sounds funny to say, but he was like adamantly, passionately against hiring sales engineers for a very long time, because we wanted to hire salespeople who were technical enough to be able to explain the solution to a technical buyer. As that changed and we moved up market, we had to realize that no, the skill we needed was actually more people that could tell a story and de-risk experimentation. And maybe it would almost like look weird if your salesperson was also being able to do technical stuff as well. And so that dramatically changed things as well for us. So the profile about someone who could speak to a brand. And then as that evolved, to your point earlier, the verticalization of the specialization, being able to talk retail to retail, auto to auto, FinServ to FinServ became critical. And I still reflect on, one of the most important things I ever did at LiveRamp was in the post-sale side, organizing my team around audiences, because what the success metrics were to them was they were using the same workflows, but for entirely different outcomes. And so it was really, really critical that we recognize that and we're able to speak in the language of the buyer and what they care about.
And we had to organize around that in terms of the product marketing and marketing side of the house too. Is like, okay, when you go into the enterprise and you start becoming more sophisticated and you have more kind of that green space to go after, the marketing team has to organize around that. We started to verticalize, especially our product marketing, and kind of rebuilt our whole pitch as well.
We decided to reorganize the whole company that way. We organized products that way. And it's interesting because we're going through something similar at Cloudinary right now, because Cloudinary there's a lot of similarities with Cloudinary and LiveRamp, but our bread and butter is selling to developers. We are an API first, developer first company. We sell to a highly technical audience. But as we expand and start talking to marketers and non-technical audiences, that requires a different skill set, right? You can't demo code to someone like me, right? I won't be able to use that. So it's a really important shift that people have to understand, that what worked for one audience won't work for another.
Yeah, definitely. And so, John, thinking about your Marketo days, and I think Marketo kind of became more of that enterprise marketing automation tool. And so when you were making kind of that like claim of that market, what were some of like the road bumps or things that you kind of wish you would have avoided during that process?
Yeah, I mean, we started just by what a lot of companies do. We just hired like one enterprise rep, and said, go out and sell, and like she was a great rep and she did sell some, but we didn't really unlock enterprise until we did much as what Allison just talked about, is organize the company around it. Literally built an enterprise sales team, an enterprise post-sales customer success team. We even split marketing into an enterprise marketing and non-enterprise marketing, and that was critical for success. Any Lord of the Rings fans, I like to say one does not simply walk into enterprise, right? you got to take it seriously, kind of to do it right. I think that was the most important thing. A couple other interesting things, our pricing model needed an overhaul. The most surprising find was that enterprise buyers expected bigger discounts. And so we literally just had to raise the list price for the enterprise edition just so that we could discount it more. And sort of just thinking thoughtfully through all that kind of stuff. What Scott mentioned about value-based consulting, critical. Like, I think that anybody who's trying to sell into an enterprise team without that is going to run into trouble, because enterprise buyers value, make one easier to calculate ROI. And then last but not least, I think some of the softer stuff about relationships became more important. And I think building out our customer advisory board, or CAB, became really important. Also because we're doing more selling into our existing customers. The mistake we made was going after the CMO of these, big enterprises. The reality is the CMO was too senior. Even though we were going after top level execs and we were going to give them extremely VIP experiences, a VP at an enterprise is plenty senior. The CMO at the enterprise, Fortune 100 companies may not even know who we are.
Yeah. And that's, we're so ingrained to think okay, let's go to the top. But really at the enterprise, the decisions are made kind of at that VP level. And that's really where you build a lot of the relationships as well. It's also interesting, I think, a lot during the live ramp days, Allison, when we would we worked with the Fortune 500 in terms of advertisers and big brands out there, and everyone's kind of moving across the enterprise. So we were very adamant about making kind of that relationship sell. And when they would move to another company, we were okay, great, we have that relationship. Can they take LiveRamp with them? And you see that a lot in our report, is that people are relying on their prior experience. And so how do you, to your point, how are we organizing to make them successful? So when they go to their next company, they're taking us with them. And that's how you can kind of maybe, really unlock that enterprise function. So Scott, you kind of talked about this a little bit on the sales side of the house, but I wanted to, thinking about, the enterprise buyer, and you talked about people could be scared, right? That's kind of scary, because if you think your bread and butter, the SMB mid-market, we're crushing it, but we know that we need to break into the enterprise. We know that's where it's going to lock a lot of those dollars. How did you manage that shift? It's a mindset, the change management, and then, you are going to lose some of your kind of lower tier customers because you have to shift resources over to the enterprise. So how did you manage that in kind of your previous organizations?
Yeah, and it really is kind of an up-leveling of the team, or bringing in folks that have that skill set and that experience. If you think about the way enterprise buyers are evaluating solutions that are different than the way that you're used to down market, and we'll leave, for the sake of this conversation, we'll leave product market fit out of it. We'll assume that your solution or whatever you're selling solves the problem at the enterprise level in one way or another. But that's kind of just the surface. And what you'll find is there are functional areas that are needed, or that are becoming kind of showstoppers for a lot of enterprises. Things around controls and partitions, whether it's application partitioning or data partitioning for different BUs or geographic areas. And that's something that you have to have the skill set. You have to be ready to address it and have content to address it during the sales cycle. Governance and compliance is another big one, right? Depending on what you're selling, that could be GDPR compliance. It could be SOC 2. It could be, we talked a little earlier, I think John was mentioning about AI. And here's the dirty little secret. A lot of your buyers they don't even know that they now need some type of Gen AI legal document about what you do with it and what you don't do with it if it's part of your solution. And so having the mindset to coach your buyers who are also kind of dealing with this changing landscape is a big one. And then I think the last part that was probably the toughest and probably sometimes the most neglected is having a mindset that focuses on the change management aspect of the sales cycle with enterprise. This is typically not a plug and play. We're talking about companies that have years, if not decades, of entrenched systems and processes and data. And so even if your solution clearly is superior and solves what they're looking to solve, it could have massive impacts. And so being able to have the credibility to talk about rollout plans and phases and training cadence and having a solution architect who kind of can talk about big picture and about how this will impact all of the other hooks that are potentially touching the system. Those were all things that we had to up level and bring into the squad. And similar to what John was mentioning in the early days, Marketo, we typically do bifurcate or create a separate sales segment and pre-sales and CSM segment to support just those, because it is that different mindset.
Yeah. And, our Allison or John, I'd love you all to chime in if like that. I think it really is kind of like that mindset, and it happens kind of like at the C-suite, at the table, where you're like, okay, we're going to make this shift. And, I think people feel really apprehensive about that. There's some questions, in the chat around, what are the differences when you're moving? We kind of talked about like SMB and you're moving away from the enterprise, and then understanding kind of that buyer journey, et cetera. Where do you guys, when you were making these mind shifts and you guys had that seat at the table, what were those conversations like? Maybe Allison, you can talk about that a little bit.
Sorry, just the question being around
the conversations that you had kind of at that table, at the leadership table, when you were going after the enterprise. Like what were the mind shift conversations that you had to have?
Well, I guess one thing I don't know if it's a direct answer to your question, but something that Scott said really resonates with me, that I think is something that's really I'm thinking about a lot right now, is that change management, ushering in the change management process. That it's just selling the technical solution or solving the problem isn't enough, right? I was just, and that is something that is maybe takes people by surprise. Like you have to kind of comfort them and show them the path to how you're going to get them where they need to go, and not assume that they can do it on their own. We had that at LiveRamp too. I remember we had a lot of experiences where we had a lot of success selling to really top end enterprises that were very had a lot of experimentation, had large teams of data science at their disposal. And then we would try to go and replicate that to an enterprise brand outside of a strategic brand, and wouldn't have as much success because they needed so much more help from us. So I think that is kind of a aha moment that I'm actually going through right now. Like we were just at a big, large brand the other day. So, it was a very big strategic conversation. And probably what ended up being 60% of the conversation was, how are you going to help us implement this change throughout our organization? That is not intuitive, right? You think you're selling a solution. You don't think you're necessarily selling a journey. And that is something that, and that, to Scott's point, that takes other resources, that takes, other types of skill sets that can be involved in a sales cycle that are non-obvious when you're selling to SMB, or not required when you're selling to SMB. So that can be difficult. And then you're talking about efficiency and growth efficiency index and ROI on the resources that you're bringing in. And how do you think about that? Like, I do think a big part of the conversation is going up market and selling to these types of buyers is going to require a bigger lift from us as a company. And we have to be prepared. How bad do you really want it? I think it was Scott that said this too. You can't just hire an enterprise rep. You have to accept that. You have to be like, we have to build an entire other thing. So I think there's almost like an organizational readiness internally that you have to prepare for if you really want to do that well. And that's not something that people are totally. I think it's not as simple as, oh, we had success in SMB, let's just go talk to bigger brands. That's not going to cut it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's one of those things that the product market fit's like really important, but it's like everything has to be on board to go after the enterprise. The entire company has to be on board to do that. And so we only have a few more minutes left, but John, I wanted to talk about measurement, because I think like we talked a lot, like how do you know you're going in the right direction what are the key like KPIs that we should be like looking at? Because I think that kind of like wraps it all like nicely. It's like, okay, if we're going after the enterprise, we've kind of started to build this whole change management across the buyer's journey. How are we going to measure that we're actually going in the right direction besides kind of landing that one big fish?
Gosh, I'll try to answer quickly. I think, first off, it's really important to start measuring pipeline quality and not just quantity. If you're in the numbers game, you're not going to succeed in the enterprise. We actually developed an expected pipeline score that we then use to drive SDR and marketing compensation, so that there was incentives to kind of create opportunities for those bigger deals. I think second, with the longer the sales cycle, the more you need leading indicators to tell you you're on the right track. You can't just wait for the revenue. And lots of people could debate what's the right leading indicator. I'm a fan of engagement. Before a company spends money with you, they'll spend time with you. And can you track, wow, the right people in this enterprise is spending time? And then third, because we're selling to more existing customers, the sort of land and expand motion becomes much more important. And so rather than just focusing on net new opportunities and new accounts, being able to track unique buying groups in the enterprise and understand, how are you creating new expansion opportunities with different buying groups becomes another important metric to track.
Yeah, I think the land and expand is really, really important, and having a team that's thinking about that, that's revenue focused, account planning, account mapping, is really important. Well, I'm sorry we didn't get to some of the questions in the chat, and we ran out of time. I think we could talk about this for another hour because there's just so much when it comes to kind of your go-to-market at the enterprise. But I wanted to thank Allison, Scott, John for joining me. It's so good to see you all, and thank you so much for all your insights. And we might have to have a round two.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you all. Have a great rest of your day, and thank you all so much for joining us.